Hey folks, in this video I'll give you a detailed summary of everything important you need to know in order to defeat every Aberrus Raid Boss on normal and heroic difficulty. A few of the later bosses are a bit more complicated, so I'll also release a full standalone guide for them later on in the week, which will go into a bit more detail. That being said, this video should contain more than enough information to help you kill every boss on heroic difficulty. With all of that out of the way, let's jump into the raid bosses, starting with Kazara the Hellforged. Kazara's primary mechanic is Dread Rifts. This debuff will target a few random players, and after 5 seconds it'll explode, dealing damage to anyone nearby and leaving behind a patch on the ground. When targeted by this ability, you should drop it towards the edges of the room. Kazara will also cast Rays of Anguish, which are laser beams that will chase after random players. On normal difficulty, these beams will eventually despawn, but on heroic difficulty, you'll need to manually kite the beam into one of the Dread Rift puddles on the ground. This will cause both the beam and the rift to disappear. When Kazara reaches 80, 60, and 40% health, she'll deal a large burst of damage to the raid and shatter a portion of her armor, causing AoE swirlies to appear throughout the room. Healers should watch the boss's health to prepare for this damage spike, and DPS players should try to save their personal defensives to help out the healers. For tanks, the only mechanic you need to worry about is Terror Claws, which is a heavy-hitting tank buster cast by Kazara once every 30 seconds. This ability deals high physical damage, low shadow damage, and leaves behind a debuff on the tank. You should taunt off your co-tank after they receive 1 stack of this debuff. Kazara has 2 final abilities. Wings of Extinction is a moderate burst of raid-wide damage that pushes everyone back. It also leaves behind a nasty dot on the raid that your healers will need to deal with. Lastly, Kazara will turn towards a random player and cast Hellbeam. This is pretty easy to deal with because if you notice she's facing you, you can just step to the side and avoid her Hellbeam. If you don't move and you get hit by the beam, you'll die very quickly. As a final note, while fighting Kazara, you should probably use Bloodlust on pull, but you can also save it for the last 40% of the fight if you find that your group is struggling to meet the healing check. Next up, I'll discuss the Amalgamation Chamber, which is one of the choices you'll have for your second boss. Before the fight begins, you'll need to divide your raid into 2 equally sized groups. This is because the initial phase of the encounter involves fighting 2 different mini-bosses, which need to be tanked on opposite sides of the room. As the fight goes on, each of these bosses will apply a stacking debuff to all nearby players, which deals moderate ticking damage. In the case of the Shadow Boss, it also reduces your maximum health. This debuff can be really nasty if it reaches high stacks, so I'd recommend having everyone in your raid, except for the tanks, switch to the opposite boss at around 10 to 13 stacks. If you remain far enough away from one of the bosses for over 20 seconds, all of your stacks for that associated debuff will fall off. Since tanks can easily survive high stacks, they should stay on the same side for all of Phase 1 just to make sure that the boss positioning doesn't get screwed up. Each of these bosses has a set of mechanics that they'll use during Phase 1. The Eternal Blaze will fire off a few lava tornadoes at a random player, and these need to be avoided. It'll also cast Fiery Meteor, which is a large swirly circle that deals less damage the more people stand inside of it. When this goes out, everyone in your raid's fire group should help soak it. On heroic difficulty, the Blaze will also cast Molten Eruption, which is a series of smaller AoE circles around the room. Each of these circles must be soaked by a single player or the raid will take heavy damage. The Shadow Boss also has 3 abilities, the first of which is Umbral Detonation. This debuff targets a few random players, causing them to explode after 6 seconds and leave a puddle on the ground. If you get targeted by this, run to the edges of the room to drop off your puddle. The Shadow Boss will also cast Coalescing Void, which causes a large purple orb to appear. After a few seconds, this orb will explode and deal heavy damage to the raid, but the damage is lessened the further away you are from the orb. When it appears, your entire raid should run away, and when it explodes, your tank should drag the boss back to where it was before. Finally, on heroic difficulty, the boss will cast Shadow's Convergence, which causes multiple small purple orbs to collapse inwards towards the boss's location. Look for an opening in between the purple balls and move through it to avoid taking any damage. For tanks, nothing too special happens during this phase. The Fire and Shadow bosses have mini tank busters called Flame Slash and Shadow Spike, respectively, but these abilities won't force you to do any tank swaps. Once both bosses reach 50% health, they'll become immune and a new boss, the Shadow Flame Amalgamation, will appear. You should use Bloodlust the moment the amalgamation becomes attackable. Your raid also no longer needs to be split up, and they should meet in the center of the room to fight this boss together. As the phase progresses, everyone will receive increasing stacks of Shadow Flame Contamination, which deals heavy ticking damage and reduces your maximum health by 1% per stack. This is the soft enrage of the fight, as you'll need to finish the boss before your stacks get too high. The first thing I'll address in this phase are the tank mechanics, as unlike before, you actually have a tank swap. The boss will first cast Withering Vulnerability, which deals massive physical damage to the current tank, and makes them take 200% increased Shadow Flame damage for 10 seconds. Once this goes out, the other tank should immediately taunt, as the amalgamation will follow up with a cone of shadow damage aimed at the current tank. Throughout this phase, you should have one tank assigned to get hit with Withering Vulnerability, while the other tank taunts off for Shadow Flame Burst. The boss has 3 additional mechanics during this phase, and each one is a fusion of the spells from phase 1 of the encounter. For instance, Gloom Conflagration will cause a large meteor circle to appear on the tank, and your raid should stand in it to split the incoming damage. Immediately after this soak goes off, a purple orb will appear that your raid should run away from. Just like in phase 1, when it explodes, you'll take less damage the further away you are from it. Blistering Twilight is a debuff applied to multiple players, and, as usual, this drops a puddle and should be taken to the edges of the room. When the debuff expires, each player will also fire off a series of lava waves that everyone needs to avoid. Finally, on heroic difficulty, the boss will cast Convergent Eruption. This causes multiple soak circles to appear throughout the room, and one person will need to stand inside of each circle. As soon as each circle gets soaked, the boss will fire an AoE swirly at your location, so you'll need to move quickly to avoid being hit. This phase may seem pretty complicated, but provided you handle all of the soaks properly and kill the boss before your healers get overwhelmed, the fight shouldn't be too tricky. Next up is Assault of the Zakali, which is the ad fight of the raid. Once again, you'll need to split your raid into 2 separate groups before the fight begins. At the start of the encounter, you'll briefly attack Warlord Cagney, who is effectively the main boss in this fight. While you will be engaging a lot of different smaller enemies during Assault of the Zakali, you need to prioritize dealing damage to Warlord Cagney whenever possible, as killing him is the only way to end the encounter. As for Bloodlust, some groups may choose to use it on pull, but during the first few weeks of the raid, I'd recommend holding it until the end of the fight. 30 seconds after the fight begins, Cagney will cause piles of rubble to appear on the ground before he becomes immune to damage and leaps away. At this point, your raid should split up into their pre-assigned groups, with one running to a balcony at the far end of the hallway, while the other runs onto the balcony near the entrance. The group near the entrance should be the one to pick up the first pile of rubble on the floor. This rubble is used to kill off certain adds which climb up the wall throughout the fight. You won't be able to kill off every add just by dropping rubble on them, but by getting rid of a few guards or huntsmen, it should make it easier for your raid to not get overwhelmed. Warlord Cagney will spawn additional pieces of rubble throughout the fight, so you should have a few players pre-assigned to grab these and knock the adds off the wall. Speaking of the adds, there are 4 different types which you'll encounter. Wall climbers are generic mobs that have no special abilities. However, tanks still need to pick them up, as the wall climbers will try to run to the doorway in the center of the room, and if they manage to reach it and attack it, they'll trigger an ability called Barrier Backfire. If this goes off, it effectively kills your entire raid. As long as tanks don't let any of these guys slip through, you should be fine. Next up, the Obsidian Guards and Flamebound Huntsmen are slightly stronger than the average wall climber. The Huntsman will fire AoE swirlies at nearby players, while the Guard will target a random player with a rectangular AoE blast. If you get targeted by this blast, you won't be able to avoid it, so just stand still and let the rest of your raid move away. Neither the Guards nor the Huntsmen are particularly dangerous, so they should be cleaved down along with the wall climbers. The truly dangerous add in this fight is the Magma Mystic, and this should always be your top kill priority. Shortly after spawning, these Mystics will cast Molten Barrier, causing them to gain a massive Absorb Shield which deals ramping pulsing damage to the raid until it's broken. As you might expect, breaking this Absorb Shield is your #1 priority, as otherwise the damage will quickly kill off your raid. Once the Mystic Shield is broken, they'll shoot out interruptible lava bolts at random players in the raid, and these should be kicked whenever possible. Finally, throughout this phase, Warlord Cagney will leap between each of the 2 platforms, and he must be picked up by the tank the moment he lands. Cagney's landing also sends out a series of AoE swirlies that need to be avoided. The boss will periodically cast Heavy Cudgel, which is a massive cone aimed at the tank. This deals heavy physical damage and increases the tank's physical damage taken by 15% for 45 seconds. This debuff can stack, so tanks should save their best defensives for when they have 2 stacks of Heavy Cudgel. Finally, tanks should make sure Cagney is faced away from the raid, so nobody else gets hit by Heavy Cudgel. After Warlord Cagney reaches 25% health, he'll run towards the center of the hallway and start the final phase. Almost immediately, he'll cast Desperate Immolation, which causes him to be healed for 10% of his maximum health over a few seconds. This heal is affected by Mortal Strike or other healing reduction debuffs, so you should try to make sure Cagney has one of these effects on him before he moves into the final phase. As mentioned before, this is a good place to use your Bloodlust if you didn't already cast it on pull. Throughout this phase, Cagney only uses 2 abilities, the first of which is Flaming Cudgel. This is mostly identical to the aforementioned Heavy Cudgel ability, but this one has a new addition. After the cone hits the tank, everyone in the raid will explode and deal fire damage to anyone within 6 yards of them. Because of this, your raid must be spread out during Flaming Cudgel, as getting hit by multiple fire explosions will almost certainly result in your death. As usual, the tank should aim this cone away from the raid. Finally, Cagney will target the nearby door with a Catastrophic Slam, and your raid must stand inside of this ability to split the incoming damage. On Heroic, this slam will also apply a debuff which increases your damage taken from Catastrophic Slam by 200%, so after you soak one of them, you probably won't be able to soak another. For this reason, on Heroic, you should only have half of your raid soak each slam, and to make it really simple, you can just use the same assignments from the platforms in Phase 1. Also, it's really important that nobody misses this soak, as Cagney will cause a barrier backfire if there aren't enough people in it to split the damage. Next, we'll take a look at the Forgotten Experiments, which is unlocked after you defeat the Amalgamation Chamber. In this encounter, you'll fight 3 different bosses, one after another, and the first you'll engage is Neldris. Neldris' primary mechanic is Rending Charge. This will target multiple players, and after a few seconds Neldris will charge to them, dealing heavy damage and applying a bleed. This charge will also hit anyone standing in between Neldris or the targeted player, so it's important that you run away from the raid if Neldris selects you for Rending Charge. Neldris will also periodically cast Bellowing Roar, which is a raid-wide AoE that deals less damage the further away from it you are. Finally, Massive Slam is a large AoE cone targeted at a random player. When the cone appears, everyone in your raid should run out of it. It's pretty straightforward. While that covers most of Neldris' unique mechanics, I want to quickly touch upon the tank ability before discussing the other 2 bosses in this fight. Infuse Strikes is a debuff that will be applied to the tank whenever they receive an auto attack from one of the bosses. This is a mechanic that all 3 bosses in this fight will use, and it's the primary thing that tanks need to worry about. This debuff will stack indefinitely as you take more auto attacks, and the only way to clear it is by coming into contact with another player that also has the Infuse Strikes debuff. What this means in practice is that one tank will hold the boss until they reach roughly 6 to 8 stacks, at which point the other tank will taunt. The second tank will then get 1 stack of Infused Strikes, and both tanks will touch each other to clear off the debuff. This causes the raid to be hit with a pulse of damage that leaves behind a dot called Infused Explosion. This dot lasts for 20 seconds, and until it expires, the tank should not clear off their Infused Strike debuffs again. Once the raid finishes off Neldris, Thadrion will join the fight. Throughout this phase, multiple players will receive a debuff called Unstable Essence, which is a dot that deals ramping damage the longer it stays on a player. When it gets dispelled, the dot will immediately jump to a nearby player, and an ad called an Erratic Remnant will spawn. These remnants deal pulsing damage to the raid and must be killed off immediately. Thadrion also has a mechanic called Violent Eruption, which is an 8-second channel that deals pulsing damage to the raid. If any Erratic Remnant ads are alive while Thadrion is channeling this ability, they'll begin pulsing massive additional damage onto the raid, which usually results in a wipe. For this reason, it's absolutely crucial that you never dispel Unstable Essence before Violent Eruption goes out. Since the damage dealt by Unstable Essence will slowly ramp up over time, healers shouldn't be in any rush to dispel it. Additionally, the fact that it immediately jumps to another player and spawns an Erratic Remnant ad means you're actively punished for dispelling this debuff too often. I'd recommend completely ignoring these debuffs until after the Violent Eruption cast finishes, at which point healers can safely dispel all of them. This will give your DPS plenty of time to kill off the Unstable Essences before Thadrion casts Violent Eruption once again. Finally, Thadrion will also cast Volatile Spew, which just fires off a few AoE swirlies across the room. Just avoid these and you should be fine. After Thadrion is killed, the final boss of the encounter, Rionthus, will appear. I'd recommend using your Bloodlust after this boss spawns. During his phase, he'll repeatedly cast Disintegrate at a few randomly selected players. If you get targeted by this ability, you'll deal splash damage to any players standing nearby, so you should run out of the raid to prevent this from happening. Throughout the fight, Rionthus will also summon Temporal Anomaly Orbs at the edges of the room that'll slowly move towards him. If an orb reaches Rionthus, he'll gain a shield for 15% of his maximum health, which is obviously not something you want to happen. Thankfully, if a player runs into this orb, it'll collide with them, dealing a bit of damage and bouncing in the other direction. While DPS players can technically help bounce the orb, you should probably have the tanks handle it when they aren't actively holding Rionthus. That being said, if the fight goes on for too long, you'll need to begin bouncing multiple anomalies at once, and that'll likely require the DPS to help out. Finally, Rionthus will periodically leap into the air and begin casting Deep Breath. This is a large rectangular AoE that crosses the entire room, and if you get hit by it, you'll probably die. If you see that Rionthus is about to cast this, look up and check to find which section of the room he's about to hit. Then, just quickly move to an area that's safe. After he finishes his first deep breath, Rionthus will immediately leap to a new location and begin to breathe a second time, so you need to be ready to move ASAP if he jumps over to your section of the room. After 2 deep breaths, Rionthus will land and the fight will continue until you kill him or he kills you. Rashok the Elder is the next boss we'll be discussing, and his mechanics are quite simple when compared to the last few. The main mechanic that he'll cast throughout the fight is Searing Slam. This will target a random player, and after a few seconds, Rashok will leap towards their location, deal heavy damage to the entire raid, and leave behind a lava puddle on the ground wherever he lands. As you might expect, players targeted with Searing Slam should always run to the edges of the room in order to drop off their lava puddles. However, it's absolutely crucial that you don't stand too close to an existing lava puddle, as Rashok will immediately wipe the raid if 2 puddles are touching. The hitbox on this is pretty unforgiving, so I'd recommend always putting a safe distance between yourself and any nearby puddles if you get targeted by Searing Slam. As a final note, these puddles will periodically shoot out lava waves that your raid will need to avoid. Rashok's next ability is Doom Flames, which fires off multiple circles around the room that need to be soaked by a single player. He has another ability, Charge Smash, which is a split damage soak centered around the tank that your entire raid should stand in. On Heroic, this will also leave behind a nasty dot. Rashok will also sometimes cast Shadow Lava Blast, which is a large AoE cone aimed in the direction of a random player. Finally, there are 2 additional abilities that tanks will need to be aware of. Rashok has a Tank Buster combo which consists of 2 abilities, Flaming Slash and Earthen Crush. During his combo, Rashok will cast one of these abilities a single time, and he'll cast the other ability twice. If one tank is hit by the same ability 2 times in one combo, they'll take 3000% increased damage and, well, die. Because of this, you should only taunt Rashok when your co-tank is about to be hit by a duplicate ability in the combo. Even if you handle this mechanic properly, it'll still deal a massive amount of damage, so it's crucial that you save major defensive cooldowns for every single combo. Rashok's final mechanic involves his energy bar, which will slowly increase as the fight progresses. If he reaches 100 energy, he'll instantly wipe the raid, which is why you need to use the conduit in the center of the room to drain energy from Rashok. To start this process, tanks will need to kite Rashok through the center of the room, and you should only do this when he's around 95 energy. This causes Rashok to be stunned for 30 seconds, during which time your raid can freely damage him. However, healers will still need to work overtime, as the boss will be pulsing ramping damage onto the entire raid. Additionally, lines of AoE swirlies will fire out from the center of the room, and players will need to avoid this. After Rashok's energy has been fully drained, he'll do a light amount of raid-wide damage before returning to Phase 1. The conduit can only be used to drain Rashok's energy twice during the fight, after which it'll break and become unusable. From that point on, you'll need to race to finish off Rashok before he reaches 100 energy and wipes your raid. As a final note, you could use Bloodlust for the conduit phases if your healers are struggling with it, but you'll probably want to use it on pull to maximize your damage. Ultimately, this decision is up to your raid leader. After defeating both Rashok and the Forgotten Experiments, you can fight Zaskarn the Vigilant Steward. The most important thing to understand about Zaskarn is that the floor tiles in his room are actually part of the encounter. Throughout the fight, Zaskarn will frequently cast Dragonfire traps, causing the 2 tiles nearest him to activate and be covered with fire. This means the tanks will need to carefully position the boss along the wall and kite him around when the tiles become active. Melee DPS will need to be especially careful when attacking Zaskarn, as standing in an active tile will cause you to take a ton of damage. This isn't the only way in which the traps will activate though, as Zaskarn will also summon adds called Dragonfire Golems. These golems will run around the room and attempt to activate additional traps, which you really don't want to happen. DPS players should try to kill these golems ASAP while they're active, and you can also use crowd control abilities like stuns, slows, grips, or knockbacks to ensure the golems don't activate any traps before they die. Once a golem has been defeated, you can loot its body to receive a salvage part, which is an extra action button that allows you to disable an active trap. While you should try to prioritize disabling traps that are in inconvenient spots, the only thing that really matters is you use every spare part before it expires, as it's always nice to have less traps active in the room. For tanks, this fight will be a little bit tricky, as you have a few things you need to worry about. First, Zaskarn will toss multiple shrapnel bombs throughout the room, and tanks need to run on top of these to soak the blast before the bomb blows up on the entire raid. Generally speaking, these bombs will instantly kill DPS players if they accidentally walk over it. However, during testing we found out that if DPS players have an immunity, they could help soak some of these bombs. I wouldn't recommend relying on this strategy, but it's important to know that it exists. While one tank is busy clearing out shrapnel bombs, the other will need to hold Zaskarn and handle his Searing Claws. This is a stacking fire debuff that gets applied to the current tank every time they're hit with one of Ziskarn's auto attacks. You should aim to taunt swap on Ziskarn at around 7 to 10 stacks, but the exact amount isn't very important. As long as all of the shrapnel bombs are clear, and all of your stacks of Searing Claws have expired, you should be safe to taunt Ziskarn. As the fight goes on, your tanks will take turns handling shrapnel bombs and moving Ziskarn around the room. Throughout the fight, Ziskarn will also cast Blast Wave, which is a heavy hit on the raid that pushes all players away from him. It's important to be mindful of your positioning when Blast Wave is about to go out, as you don't want to accidentally get pushed into a Dragonfire trap or a Shrapnel Bomb. On Heroic, he'll also apply Unstable Embers to multiple players, which is a dot that explodes after 10 seconds and deals bonus damage to anyone standing nearby. I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but if you get this debuff, you should run out of the raid so you don't hit anyone else. Thankfully, this one doesn't drop a puddle or anything of the sort, you just need to stand 5 yards away from other players. The final mechanic of Ziskarn's fight is Tactical Destruction. This causes some of the nearby dragon statues along the wall to glow before pulsing fire damage in a large area. Each statue will fire off multiple fire pulses in a row, which will increase in size every time until the pulse reaches the center of the room. If anyone gets hit by this pulse, they'll die immediately, so running away from the active statues is your top priority. Something that isn't communicated by the journal is that every time Ziskarn casts Tactical Destruction, an additional dragon statue will begin pulsing fire. The first cast only affects 2 statues, but the second will affect 3 statues, and so on. This mechanic, along with the Dragonfire traps, is the softened rage of the fight, as active statues during Tactical Destruction mean you'll have very little space in the room to hide. Because of how impactful this mechanic is, it effectively dictates how you deal with everything else in the encounter. When Tactical Destruction activates, the entire raid will need to run to the opposite side of the room, and tanks will need to quickly reposition Ziskarn against the far wall. If you don't do this fast enough, he may activate traps in the middle of the room, which gives you less space to work with. Also, because you won't be able to attack the golems while Tactical Destruction is going off, it's crucial that your DPS kill them the moment they spawn. If you delay killing a golem for too long, Tactical Destruction may force you to run away from it, allowing the golem to freely activate multiple traps while you're stuck on the opposite side of the room. As you can probably tell, Ziskarn is a very chaotic fight that'll likely be the first major wall for many guilds. Before fighting him, your raid should work out a plan for how they want to move the boss around the room, as this means you'll likely need to do less thinking on the fly. If you manage to get the movement down and deal with the golems efficiently, Ziskarn should fall over. The next boss you'll encounter is Magmarax, and this is the classic Sludge Fist style damage and healing check for the raid. The main ability he'll cast throughout the fight is Molten Spittle, which is a debuff applied to multiple random players. When it expires, the affected players will explode, dealing damage to anyone nearby and dropping a puddle on the ground. Unlike many other abilities, you don't necessarily want to run to the edge of the room with this debuff. The puddle that it creates will slowly grow in size over time unless players are standing inside of it. As more people stand inside of these puddles, they'll begin to shrink until they disappear entirely. However, doing this will cause you to gain stacks of Searing Heat, which is a nasty fire dot that lasts for 15 seconds. If you let this buff reach 25 stacks, it'll kill you instantly, though the ticking damage will likely already become lethal even if you let it reach 10 stacks. The best way to handle this mechanic is to drop the puddles just far enough away from Magmarax so that he doesn't get hit. If the boss touches a magma puddle, he'll begin to cast Blazing Tantrum, which effectively causes a wipe. By dropping the puddles just out of range of him, your DPS can quickly clear them without losing too much uptime on the boss. It's important that you let your Searing Heat stacks fully expire before you try to soak another puddle, as otherwise your stacks will be fully refreshed and you'll begin to take a lot of damage. As long as no puddles are dropped beneath the boss and everyone in your raid helps soak them, this mechanic shouldn't be too difficult. As a final note, when Magmarax is about to die, you can probably justify dropping the puddles on the opposite side of the room, as they'll take quite a while to expand across the entire platform. While these puddles are the most important part of the fight, there are still other mechanics that you need to be aware of. Magmarax will periodically cast Igniting Roar, which deals heavy raid-wide damage and causes multiple individual soak circles to appear throughout the room. Every single one of these circles needs to be soaked, as otherwise they'll deal massive damage to the raid and form an additional puddle, which is really, really bad. That being said, after soaking one of these puddles, you'll take 150 additional damage from them for 1 minute, which means you can't help soak 2 Igniting Roars in a row. As long as people do musical chairs properly and don't double up on a single soak, you should have more than enough people to cover every Igniting Roar. Magmarax has another ability called Blazing Breath, which is a massive cone aimed at a random player. If you're standing too far away from Magmarax, it may be difficult to avoid this cone, so you should always try to stand somewhat close to him even if you're a ranged DPS or a healer. Magmarax's final regular ability is Overpowering Stomp, which deals heavy damage to the raid and sends everyone flying away from him. The knockback effect on this ability is really powerful, and there aren't any walls that you can put your back to. While many classes such as Death Knights, Monks, and Demon Hunters can simply negate the knockback, classes like Priest and Paladin will struggle to deal with it. Ideally, you should have other ways to handle this knockback, such as a rescue from a friendly evoker or a well-timed Warlock gateway, but if you're out of options, you'll just need to make sure that you're standing in a location that doesn't send you flying into the lava. Additionally, if there's any active magma puddles in the room, make sure you don't get knocked into one and accidentally refresh your Searing Heat stacks. Magmarax's tank mechanic is Incinerating Maws, and this is thankfully pretty easy to deal with. It deals heavy physical damage to the current tank spread out across 3 different hits, and leaves behind a stacking fire dot that lasts for 30 seconds. After one tank has received all 3 hits from a single Incinerating Maw, the other tank should taunt the boss. The final aspect of Magmarax that's worth noting is his Hardened Rage, which happens after he reaches 100 energy. This causes him to cast Catastrophic Eruption, which will kill off your raid very quickly. It takes around 4 to 5 minutes for Magmarax to reach his maximum energy, so you have until then to kill Magmarax before he kills you. Echo of Neltharion is the penultimate boss of the raid, and while he's a decent step up in difficulty, most of his mechanics are pretty easy to understand. At the start of the fight, your entire raid should group up on one side of the room, and your tanks will need to taunt Neltharion over to the rest of the raid. This specific positioning is important because Neltharion will create rock walls which divide the room into 5 different sections. These rock walls can't be crossed by normal means, so if you get stuck in a different section away from your raid, you'll need to wait for a bit to rejoin the fight. Dealing with these rock walls is your primary objective during Phase 1 of the encounter. Neltharion has 2 abilities which directly interact with them, the first one being Rushing Darkness. This ability targets a few randomly selected players in the raid, which you can see indicated by a faint purple line connecting Neltharion and the targeted players. When it goes off, the affected players will take damage and be knocked away from Neltharion, causing them to break any rock walls that they come into contact with. Additionally, anyone standing in between Neltharion and the targeted player will be silenced for 3 seconds. It's important to note that breaking a section of the rock wall will cause you to take a moderate chunk of additional damage, and the entire raid will receive a light dot for every piece of the wall that gets broken. On its own, this dot is fairly trivial, but it can stack up to be really nasty if you break too many pieces of the wall at once. Breaking a wall will also cause AoE swirlies to shoot out across the room, and the raid will need to avoid these. All of that being said, on normal and heroic difficulty, there's actually no reason for DPS players to break a rock wall. Every single time Rushing Darkness goes out, Neltharion will reform the rock walls after a few seconds, making it completely pointless to break them using Rushing Darkness. As a result, you should always aim Rushing Darkness into the walls of the boss arena, as this will allow your group to take less damage, and it means you won't be knocked back quite as far. Everyone else in the raid just needs to avoid standing on top of Rushing Darkness so they don't get silenced for 3 seconds. Neltharion's other ability that interacts with the rock walls is his tank buster, Calamitous Strike. Just like Rushing Darkness, this will deal heavy damage to the tank and knock them back, causing them to break any walls they come into contact with. However, Neltharion won't immediately reform the walls after a tank breaks them, so tanks should use this knockback to open up a path for the raid leading into another section of the room. As you might expect, tanks should taunt the boss immediately after each cast of Calamitous Strike. The reason you'll need to move around the room during this phase is because of Neltharion's next ability, Echoing Fissure. Shortly after hitting the tank with Calamitous Strike, Neltharion will create a fissure at his location that deals massive damage to the entire raid. This damage will be lessened the further away you are from it, so the moment Neltharion begins casting Echoing Fissure, your entire raid should move into the next section of the room. This process will repeat multiple times throughout Phase 1, and every time Neltharion creates a new Echoing Fissure, the old ones will also explode for additional raid damage. This effectively serves as the softened rage of Phase 1, as eventually the fissures will one-shot your raid if you have too many of them active at once. Finally, throughout Phases 1 and 2, Neltharion will cast Volcanic Heart on random players. This debuff is pretty straightforward. Just run it out of the raid and make sure nobody is standing within 15 yards of you when it expires. After Neltharion reaches 70% health, he'll transition into Phase 2, causing him to break and reform all of the walls in the room while dealing pulsing damage to the raid. While the boss is reforming the walls, you should look for orange swirlies on the ground, which indicate where these new walls will appear. Make sure your entire raid moves into one section of the room before the walls are created, as otherwise you'll be cut off from everyone else. In Phase 2, Neltharion will continue to cast Volcanic Heart and Rushing Darkness, but you should handle these abilities in the exact same way as you did during Phase 1. Additionally, there are a few bonus AoE swirlies that your raid will need to avoid, and as the phase progresses, Neltharion will deal ramping pulsing damage to your raid. If you aren't able to end the phase fast enough, Neltharion's AoE pulse will eventually kill you. In order to end this phase, you'll need to defeat the 3 Voices from Beyond ads that appear throughout the room. On normal difficulty, every player can attack these ads, but on heroic it's a little bit more complicated. Neltharion will debuff multiple players in your raid with Corruption, and this causes them to appear hostile and receive damage from friendly player attacks. Be very careful about using heavy-hitting abilities right before Corruption goes out, as you don't want to accidentally kill off a member of your raid. The main advantage of being debuffed with Corruption is that it allows you to attack the Voice from Beyond ads. When these ads spawn, they'll come with a small absorb shield, and you'll need to break this shield in order to make the ad attackable by the rest of your raid. When the shield is broken, Corruption will be removed from all players, and your entire raid should swap to the vulnerable Voice from Beyond and finish it off. After killing off the first Voice from Beyond, you'll want to move into another section of the room to start killing the second ad, and once again, you'll clear a path through the rock walls by using the Tank Buster. In Phase 2, Neltharion's Tank Buster is called Sunder Shadow, and it works a bit differently than the ability in Phase 1. After Neltharion hits you, you'll take heavy physical damage and your soul will be knocked out of your body. On the tank screen, they'll be in full control over their soul, and this allows them to pass through the rock walls unhindered. On everyone else's screen, the tank's soul will be invisible, and their body will be sat unmoving in front of Neltharion. After a few seconds, Neltharion will deal physical damage to the tank's body and kick it in the direction of the tank's soul. The tank will then take shadow damage equal to their body's missing health, and since they have no control over that, healers should try to fully heal the tank's body before it collides with their soul. Tanks should also try to have major defensives prepared for this, just in case the healers can't top off their body. Finally, any walls that the tank's body passes through as it moves towards the soul will be broken. This is probably the most complicated tank buster ever created, but the TLDR is that after the tank gets hit, they should run through a nearby rock wall so that their body passes through it after it's hit by Neltharion. To make this a little bit easier to line up, the game will connect your soul to your body with a large purple line. Assuming you manage to break the wall properly, the rest of your raid can move through the gap and begin attacking the second Voice from Beyond. This process will repeat until all 3 Voices from Beyond are dead, at which point Neltharion will enter his third and final phase. This phase is a pretty straightforward damage burn, and you should always save your bloodlust for this part of the fight. At the start of Phase 3, Neltharion will once again destroy and reform every rock wall in the room, and he'll continue to cast Rushing Darkness and Calamitous Strike, which was the tank buster from Phase 1. As usual, Rushing Darkness should be aimed into the wall, but in this phase, you should also aim Calamitous Strike into the wall. During Neltharion's final phase, it is actively detrimental to break any rock walls, as he'll frequently turn a set number of them into patches of Sundered Reality. These patches will spew out an endless supply of Twisted Aberration ads, which do nothing outside of auto-attacking the tanks. However, these aberrations will deal increasing damage the longer they stay alive, so your DPS will need to kill them off before the tanks get overwhelmed. These Sundered Reality patches are also important for dealing with Neltharion's final ability, Ebon Destruction. This cast will deal lethal damage to the entire raid, but if you're standing inside of a Sundered Reality patch, the damage you take will be reduced by 99%. However, standing inside of one of these patches also makes you deal 99% less damage, so you should only run into them shortly before Neltharion finishes casting Ebon Destruction. Whenever a Sundered Reality patch is used to negate Ebon Destruction, the patch will disappear. This means it'll no longer summon endless waves of Twisted Aberrations, so ideally you should stand in as many puddles as possible during each Ebon Destruction to make sure they get closed. As the phase progresses, you'll eventually run out of Sundered Reality patches, making it impossible to avoid the damage from Ebon Destruction. This serves as the hardened rage of the fight, as Neltharion will instantly kill your raid if you haven't defeated him by that point. While there is one final boss in the raid, Scale Commander Sarkareth, he was not available for testing during the PTR, and as such I have no footage of him and no reliable strategy outside of guesswork. That being said, I will eventually make a complete guide for normal and heroic Sarkareth, which will be shown on screen now whenever I end up finishing it. Lastly, if you want to learn more about the other raid bosses or Mythic Plus dungeons in Season 2 of Dragonflight, make sure to check out my playlist of guides linked in the video description below.